Hi, welcome back. We're reading the Bunjee Venture by Stan Murtry, written back in 1977, and we've been given permission to read and listen to it by the lovely publishing company, Cress Rulls Publishing Company. I've emailed Simon there, and the very kind gentleman has said yes, we can read it. Now, in the last chapter, Mr Winsborrow, Dad of Andy and Karen, had made this big ball shape time machine, and he'd made it out of bits and bobs around the house, and he'd made it all balanced on one single pole. Now, he'd gone into Mrs Winsborrow, and he'd gone into Andy and Karen's two children, 14 and 12 I think they are, and they'd seen him set off to the time of the dinosaurs. That's the time they'd chosen. However, at the last minute when he slammed the door, it fell over, exploded, blinding flash, and unfortunately, even though they've looked in the garage for 2 full hours, there is no sign of Mr Winsborrow. So, let's see. Now, if you remember, Mrs Winsborrow was a mad knitter. She was one of those people, I wish I was, who could just knit without looking. I would be knitted if I tried to knit without looking at what I was doing. Please, Mum, don't cry anymore. Andy looked across at his mum, who sat on the settee, dabbing at her red, swollen eyes with what was now a 4 metre long of wet scarf. "We'll find him, don't you worry," he said. Mrs Winsborrow took a sip of her tea from the cup that Karen held out to her. "Oh, how can you find him, you silly boy?" she wailed. "He's dead. Your poor father's dead, blown to bits by that crackpot contraption of his. Why did he have to start this inventing craze?" Her face screwed up in anguish, her shoulders started to shake, and then, burying her head once more in the soggy scarf, she went into another fit of tears. Andy looked across at his sister and shrugged hopelessly. Karen's eyes were also red-rimmed from crying, and Andy had been battling courageously to fight down the big lump in his throat that threatened to rise up and force him to burst into tears too. It was only the firm conviction that his father was still alive that stopped him from crying. He gestured with his head to the door, and Karen followed him outside. "What are we going to do?" said Karen when they were outside in the back garden. "I suppose we'll have to tell the police that Daddy's blown himself up." "I don't think Dad's blown himself up," said Andy. He opened the side door into the garage, leant against the door frame, and looked thoughtfully at the wreckage inside. "Well, go on, smarty pants," said Karen. "Where is he then, if he hasn't blown himself to bits?" Andy turned round to face his sister. He had a faraway expression in his eyes, and when he spoke, it was with an air of certainty and conviction. "I think his time machine worked." Karen stared at him. "You mean you think he's gone back in time, just like he said he would?" "Yeah, I think he's alive. I think his machine worked and that Dad had gone back in time and is now wandering about in a world that was about 120 million years ago," said Andy. "Ah, don't be so stupid," spluttered Karen. "Daddy's inventions never worked. You know that. It isn't possible." "Listen," said Andy. He sat his sister down on the old wooden box inside the garage, then sat himself down on the workbench top. "I know that most of poor old Dad's inventions went wrong. We were always pulling his leg about it, but I think that perhaps this time he really did stumble onto something big, a great big idea, something that would do what he said it would do and stagger the great scientists of the world. But as usual, something did go wrong. I think his mistake this time was that he couldn't be bothered finding another 3 legs for his machine. The leg that the machine stood on was far too rickety and unsafe. But if what you say is true, said Karen, how did he intend to get back from 120 million years ago to the present time without his time machine? But don't you see, said Andy, that's where the whole thing went wrong. Now, Andy was waving his arms in the air a bit like his dad did now. The machine was supposed to go back in time with him. If he'd built it with 4 legs, it would have worked perfectly, as it was with that one silly leg from the carport. It was completely unstable. Everything was going smoothly until he slammed the door. The machine toppled off the bench onto the floor, and something in the machine, some vital part, must have become dislodged with the fall. Instead of both Dad and the time machine going back in time, the machine stayed here and Dad was sent back to the dinosaurs on his own. He's not here. Karen now looked even more forlorn. Yeah, I suppose we would have found some trace of him otherwise, she said. But what are we going to do? Poor old Daddy with all those pterodactyls and dinosaurs. We'll never see him again. She sniffed and a great big tear rolled down her cheek. Andy fished about in his pocket and produced a dark grey hanky with bits of chewing gum on it. He held it out to Karen, who decided it was better to wipe her eyes on her sleeve. They sat quietly for a while, thinking the same thought. How were they going to get along without their dad? True, they'd not seen very much of him with what was going on with the inventing craze, but on the times that he was in their company, he was great fun to be with. The thought of him being all alone with great scaly monsters of prehistoric times and unable to escape to the present time filled them with dread. Perhaps he'd already been eaten. Suddenly, Andy leapt in the air, waving his arms excitedly. "I've got it!" he yelled, so loudly that his sister fell backwards off the box onto the garage floor. "Got what? Got what?" she said, picking herself up and frowning at an oily patch that now had appeared on her white socks. But Andy didn't hear her. He was grovelling around on the floor, pushing bits of machinery aside, collecting together all the bits of paper with scribbled notes on them, all the blueprinted plans and any other things written or drawn that he could find. What are you doing?" said Karen. I've got it! I've got it! I've got it! Whooped Andy. He scooped the bundle of papers together and placed them on the workbench, then turned to face Karen with a triumphant gleam in his eye. "We are going to rescue him." "Rescue him? But how? With these?" Andy pointed to the pile of plans on the bench. But I don't see. I don't, spluttered the perplexed Karen. "We are going to sort out all the plans and diagrams that Dad left, and we're going to build another time machine following his drawings, but built with 4 legs instead of 1. And then we're going to go back 120 million years and rescue him." Karen goggled at her brother, as though he'd gone mad. "Where are we going to get all the bits and pieces?" she said at last. "Well, quite a lot of the bits and pieces are still here," said Andy, sweeping his arm around the wreckage on the floor. "Some are a bit bent, and some of it are beyond repair, so we'll have to find some new bits. We'll have to buy some new electrical plugs, yes, and buy some more bits, and maybe a few bolts and nuts, and I bet if we try hard enough, we can do it. What do you think?" "Well, I can't see it working, but I suppose if it's the only thing hope we've got," she said. "It's going to take ages, though. Daddy might have been eaten by now." "Right," said Andy. "So the sooner we start, the better." And with that, they both turned to the bench and with furrowed brows started to try and make sense out of the mass of figures and squiggles and drawings on the blueprints in front of them. "Heavens," said Karen after a while. "This is going to take at least a fortnight." And that's the end of chapter 2. Let's see what happens.